useful until you're discarded. Have you ever been used by someone and only realized it when you were no longer useful? Have people looked for you out of interest, out of convenience, for what you could provide, never for who you are? In college, you become essential when it's time for the assignment and invisible after the grade. At work, your boss values you while you solve problems, produce, and accept everything in silence. In relationships, you are needed as long as you please, as long as you give in, as long as you erase yourself. And the day you stop, you become disposable, like an object without value. Have you ever felt that emptiness that comes when you realize you were only tolerated, never protected? Have you carried the feeling of emotional trash, of being replaced without warning, of being left behind without explanation? What hurts the most is not just the loss, it's the discovery. You were not loved, you were useful. When interest ends, affection disappears with it. And when someone's plan goes wrong, almost always the one who pays the price is the one who never had a choice from the beginning. Hagar enters the Bible exactly like this. She was not a wife, she was a servant. She had no voice, no rights, no choice. She was used as a solution to a problem she did not create, and when the human plan failed, she was pushed into the desert, pregnant and alone. This story is in Genesis 16, and it begins with a hard truth. Hagar enters the story as a resource, not as a person. This is where everything begins, when being needed is not the same as being loved, and when you realize that you are already in the desert, when you are used but not protected. Have you noticed how sometimes people only see you while you are useful? That was the case with Hagar. The moment she becomes pregnant, what seemed like a solution turns into rejection, and what was necessity turns into abandonment. You give your best, you hold everything together, you solve crises, but when the situation changes, the affection disappears. And it hurts because the feeling is not just loss. It is silent disposal. Right there, a spiritual desert begins, one that confuses identity and purpose. Maybe you are living something similar today. A relationship where you only matter as long as you emotionally support the other person. A job that exhausts you and replaces you without explanation. Even faith environments that celebrate your service but ignore your pain. Being needed is not the same as being loved, and that confronts the soul. You begin to think that your value is in what you do, not in who you are. Little by little, spiritual identity becomes fragile, cracked on the inside. But notice this. It is there, in the desert, that the Lord finds her. It was not Hagar who found God. It was God who went to meet her. The angel of the Lord calls her by name, asks where she comes from and where she is going, and listens to her pain without interrupting. After receiving the promise about the son she was carrying, Hagar does something rare. She gives a name to the God who spoke to her. She calls him El Roi, saying, "You are the God who sees me," because she was seen in the place where no one else was looking for her. Sarah's rejection did not cancel God's word, and human abandonment did not interrupt the promise. There, Hagar discovers that even in the desert, God remains attentive. And when this truth reaches the heart, something begins to be restored on the inside. Not with noise, but with presence. Perhaps this was only the beginning of a story that God was still writing. The desert as a consequence of rejection. Do you realize how not every desert is the result of rebellion? Sometimes you did not choose to leave, you were pushed. Hagar flees while pregnant, alone, without a map and without a visible promise, carrying a life in her body and rejection in her soul. Abandonment creates a kind of spiritual desert where you keep walking just so you don't break. It is not courage, it is survival. And maybe you are there right now, trying to breathe where no one else stayed. Today, something similar happens when you emotionally disappear so it won't hurt anymore. When you isolate yourself because talking has become exhausting. You keep functioning, working, smiling, but inside something has been slowly closing off. It is not coldness, it is self-protection after being used and left behind. Hagar's desert was not born from rebellion, it was born from pain. And there is a God who sees even when you can no longer explain yourself. That is where something begins to change. Even if it still seems like only silence, the God who sees those who were forgotten. You may have been forgotten by people, but you were not overlooked by God. In the middle of the desert, when no one was looking for Hagar, the angel of the Lord finds her. Not by chance, but by intention. God calls her by name, not by function, not by mistake, not by a story of rejection. There on the hot ground of abandonment, something powerful is born, spiritual identity being restored. When God sees you, He does not ask where you failed. He reveals who you are. While the world insists on calling you by what you deliver, God insists on calling you by what you carry. People say, serve, fix it, endure. But God says, I see you. Elroy is not just a beautiful title, it is a real experience of divine provision in the spiritual desert. When you understand this, something changes inside. Rejection loses its strength and God's promise gains space. And maybe this realization is only the beginning of what is still going to be revealed along the way. When God tells you to go back to a difficult place, you expect God to take you out of the place that hurt you, but sometimes He prepares you to go through it in a different way. Hagar does not receive a shortcut, she receives inner strengthening. God does not ignore the rejection, but He also does not allow it to define the end of the story. Going back is not a setback when you return with your spiritual identity aligned. The process continues, but now you know that God sees you even there. This speaks directly to real life, to situations where you need to go back stronger, not more naive. Going back to a difficult job, a necessary conversation, a tense environment. But different on the inside. God does not validate abuse, but He sustains those who must walk through processes without losing their soul. When you go back knowing who is with you, fear decreases and God's promise begins to guide every step. And this crossing still reveals something greater ahead. The second abandonment and the false sense of an ending. Does the second abandonment hurt more than the first? Hagar and Ishmael are sent away for good, without a plan, without supplies, without human protection. The water runs out, and with it, hope seems to run out as well. The promise, the strength. Sometimes you also reach a point where there are no emotional resources left. It is not rebellion, it is exhaustion. It is when the spiritual desert becomes too heavy. So you step back, not because of lack of love, but to avoid watching the pain increase. You distance yourself from people, from dreams, even from prayers, just to survive. It feels like the end, but it is only the limit of human strength. Heaven is still attentive even when you think it is over, even when everything in you screams abandonment. And it is precisely in that silence that something begins to move, even without you realizing it, the miracle that was already there. Have you noticed that many times what changes is not the situation but the way you see it? God opens Hagar's eyes, and the well had been there the whole time. The miracle did not fall from heaven in that moment. It was revealed. How many times do you pray expecting something new when God only wants to heal the way you see what already exists? In the middle of the spiritual desert, divine provision may be closer than your pain allows you to see. Desperation does not change God, but it changes the way you perceive reality. When rejection and abandonment press in, vision becomes blurred, faith grows tired, spiritual identity weakens. Even so, God sees you. Elroy remains attentive even when all you can see is scarcity. And perhaps the next step is not to chase another miracle, but to ask for healed eyes to recognize God's promise that never stopped being there. Perhaps now you realize that this narrative was never only about a woman in the desert, but about what happens when someone is pushed out of human plans and falls directly into the hands of God. Hagar did not leave protected, she left wounded. She did not leave celebrated, she left invisible. And even so, it was on that dry path, pregnant, exhausted, and without guarantees, that heaven decided to draw near. There are encounters that only happen when all other voices fall silent. There are revelations that only arise when silence is all that remains inside. At some point in your journey, you were also left behind emotionally, not because you did something wrong, but because you stopped being convenient. People moved on, doors closed, promises seemed to evaporate, and you called it abandonment when maybe it was transition. Hagar thought she was being discarded, but she was being repositioned. The desert was not the end of the story, it was the setting where her spiritual identity stopped depending on others. There is a very specific kind of pain in believing that God has forgotten you. It does not scream, it weighs heavy. But it is exactly in that place that Elroy reveals himself as the God who sees, even when no one else is looking. When the water ran out and Hagar stepped away so she would not have to watch her son die, heaven did not turn its face away. Her eyes were opened, and what seemed non-existent had been there all along. Sometimes what is missing is not a miracle. It is healed perception. If you want to walk through this story calmly, spend time in Genesis 16 and then return to Genesis 21 without rushing, letting the text touch where it hurts. Perhaps you will discover that the place where you thought everything ended is actually where God began to write something new. The desert did not cancel you, it revealed you. And what seemed like abandonment may be exactly the point where you were seen more deeply than ever before. If this message touched a sensitive place inside you, do not let it pass in silence. Sometimes putting it into words is the first step of inner healing. Write in the comments with simplicity and truth, God sees me. Not as a slogan, but as a confession from someone who is still crossing the spiritual desert, carrying questions but choosing to remain. And if you long for content that speaks to the soul, stay here. This channel exists to tell biblical stories that do not expose but restore, that do not shout but walk with you, that reveal a God who sees even when everything feels like abandonment. Subscribe, walk with us, because there are still encounters, inner healing, and God's promises waiting for you.